Lars has been in IDE 2 years ago, if I remember correctly. He is a configurator, management educator, and researcher with some weak point for Agile and DevOps. Is it true?
Yeah, that's true.
Okay, welcome. Welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me back, so I can share my passion for configuration management with you. And I really miss that it's online this year, so we can't have the dinner, which is the great deals about IDI. So my name is Lars Bendix. I'm running a Scandinavian network of excellence for people interested in software configuration management. And we actually also have an Italian branch of that network. When I need something to eat, I also work as a professor at Lund University in Sweden, and I teach a course on software configuration management, and also I'm involved with our agile things. So I've been a customer and I've been a coach for student projects, and for the past almost 10 years, I've been running a course on coaching of agile teams. So this is work that I'm doing together with other people. So I've been working for many years together with Christian Pendleton from Efficode Pragma in Malmö, and he's also a configuration management specialist. And we started out with Agile, then we moved on to continuous delivery, continuous software engineering, and now we are sort of into DevOps. So we are more or less following the buzzwords around. Last year, I had 2 master thesis students, so we added some workforce to our project, and they did their master thesis on software configuration management in a DevOps context. Now, the premise for our work as configuration managers, we are absolutely sure that no project can be successfully carried out without some sort of configuration management. If it's a software project, it needs to be software configuration management. If it's any other project, like building an aircraft carrier, building a car, building a mobile phone, or whatever it is that you're doing, then you need to do configuration management. It might not always be called software configuration management. It might not always be carried out by software configuration management people, specialists. And in DevOps projects, looking at it from the outside, it actually seems like it's pretty absent. So when configuration management people, they look at DevOps, they find very little configuration management. And when DevOps people from the inside look out, then they sort of tend to ignore software configuration management. But it's not absent. It's sort of implicit, it's a little invisible, but I'll show you some of the things that you can do on DevOps project. The research questions, both for the master's thesis and the things that Christian Pendleton and I were sort of trying to discover, was how to carry out software configuration management in the DevOps context. We were pretty sure how to carry it out in normal traditional waterfall context. We also knew something about agile context, but this new buzzword of DevOps made us curious to watch what things from traditional configuration management are not needed in the DevOps context. So what things from our traditional toolbox are not needed anymore. What new things do we need to add to our toolbox? Are there some special things in DevOps that require some new concepts and new principles from the software configuration management? And the old principles that we are used to implement, how should they be cast differently in a DevOps context? The objectives of the presentation is that after the presentation, I hope that you know what role configuration management has also on DevOps projects, that you have a better idea of where you need software configuration management activities in your DevOps processes and DevOps projects, and understand what SCM activities that you actually carry out currently, even if you might not understand and realize that these are SCM activities. So this presentation will be sort of a brief overview a quick appetizer. So there's a lot of things that I will not go into details with. There will be references for where you can go and read more, and there will be a list of references at the end of the presentation. So the agenda for this presentation is that we need to know a little bit about what DevOps is. We need to talk a little bit about what software configuration management is, and then how can we do software configuration management on DevOps projects. And at the end, there will be some Q&A. Now, what is DevOps? Well, the really short version of what DevOps is that I really don't know. I became a little wiser after the presentation from Credem earlier today, and but the problem for me is that in the beginning, DevOps started as putting Dev and Ops together, and then it has sort of caught on. And if I ask 10 people, I get sort of 8 different explanations of what DevOps is, and sometimes they are not in agreement with each other. So when I have to talk about DevOps for my students, what I do is that instead I will try to explain them why should we use DevOps, and then they hopefully get an implicit understanding of what DevOps is. As an example, I use Spotify. So Spotify, they don't know their customers. They cannot talk to their customers to understand what it is that they want from Spotify and what it is that they don't want, but they can monitor what their customers do. So when you have a lot of customers out there, if you have only one customer, you can sort of do normal agile. But if you have a lot of customers that you don't know, that you can't talk to, you can monitor what they're doing and observe what they're doing. At Spotify, they want to bring new ideas into production as fast as possible. If a bright new idea catches on, then it is further developed and explored. If it doesn't, then it simply dies there. So we can experiment. We can experiment and get feedback from our monitoring our customers very fast. If we implement something quick and dirty, maybe just sort of almost a mock-up of an idea, if they don't use it, then we don't need to develop it further. If they use it, then we can sort of polish it and add some more functionality to that part of Spotify. So from that perspective, DevOps is sort of a requirements engineering method. So trying to figure out what are the requirements for the applications that we are putting out to customers. It seems like to some degree what they're doing in the bank of Credem is a little bit like what Spotify is doing. I know other banks that seems not to monitor what their customers do, but have a fairly fixed opinion of what it is that their customers need. That's probably not a very good DevOps approach. So the emphasis is on getting very fast from idea to production. So very fast from a question, is this something that is interesting for our customers, to an answer, no, they don't use it. In 1 month, it's been used 12 times, so let's not waste more time on that. Now, the more long version of DevOps, and we needed to have for the research project with the master's thesis, we needed something more concrete than Spotify as an example of DevOps development. So my students, they did a literature review, and they did some interviews with people, configuration managers that were also moving into the field of DevOps, and they also interviewed quite a few DevOps people that identified themselves as doing DevOps development, to try to figure out, not a definition, because we really didn't need a definition, but if we needed to figure out how configuration management, software configuration management should be carried out in the DevOps context, we needed to know more about what are the characteristics of DevOps. And these were the characteristics. If you want to know more about the motivation and then the explanation about all these characteristics, you can look up the master thesis, which is very interesting reading. A couple of years ago, so maybe it's not current anymore, I went to Wikipedia to become more knowledgeable about what DevOps is. And from Wikipedia, the goals of DevOps is improved deployment frequency, lower failure rates of new releases, shortened lead time between fixes, and faster mean time to recovery. They aim to maximize the predictability, the efficiency, the security, and the maintainability of the operational processes. And actually, when I show this to configuration management specialists, they are a little surprised because they actually say, well, if you had said that this was what software configuration management is aiming at, then we would have said that this is almost like it is. So there are actually quite a lot of similarities between the goals of DevOps and the goals of software configuration management. So there's a good chance that we could become friends in the future. So a little bit about what software configuration management is. The short version is that it's this cool stuff that will facilitate a team to coordinate people and things so they can carry out changes in an orderly fashion, right from the conception of an idea through to production and retirement, and avoid any chaos and confusion in the process. So if you utilize software configuration management, it'll make sure that you know exactly what you have, not just when it is in production, but also while you're developing it. And SCM will provide a project with all the quality gates that they might wish for. Software configuration management can be done and is often done in very formal and rigid ways. So on top-down waterfall projects, very hierarchical projects, that's the way it's done. But it can also be done in a more informal and flexible way, bottom-up agile, and hopefully also for DevOps. Now, the slightly longer version of what software configuration management is, my students also needed to look into that. So they again did a literature review and they did some interviews with software configuration management specialists. And what you see here, configuration identification, configuration status accounting, configuration control, configuration audit, and SCM plans is sort of what you get if you read the standards and most textbooks about software configuration management. So this is more like the traditional definitions. Going more into details with the day-to-day work of a team and not just what the company needs, then we get some more characteristics, more activities. It's about build management, release management, change management, version control, collaboration, teamwork, and workspace management. Again, if you want to know the details about all these, you can look up in the master thesis report. Now, Christian and I and some other people, we started looking into configuration management for Agile many years ago, and exactly for the same reason as we then transited into looking for software configuration management for DevOps. So from the outside, it looked like there was sort of no explicit software configuration management. And we identified some of the agile practices that are very highly related to software configuration management. So collective code ownership, continuous integration, test-driven development, frequent releases, planning game, and refactoring. These are the more specific practices that you get from extreme programming. And we tried to identify what should be done to support these activities. And since DevOps has sort of an agile component, then the software configuration management for Agile also addresses these parts. A couple of years earlier, based on experience with our student projects doing extreme programming, we identified a number of sub-practices that they should do if they wanted to the project agile projects, the extreme programming projects to run in a smooth way. Again, if you want to know the details and how the motivations for these sub-practices and how they relate to each other, you can go and look up the paper from 2004. Now, what my master's thesis students did was that so on one side, they had all the characteristics that they had identified for DevOps. So this was sort of the union of all the things that the people they had interviewed talked about, the union of all the things that came up during the literature review. And on the left side, there were all the activities, the software configuration management activities that they had identified. So the real work that they did was that they were trying to relate these. So if we zoom in, and if we focus on the DevOps characteristic of sharing, then sharing is related to the SCM activity of teamwork. It's related to the SCM activity of version control. And you cannot see here, it's also related to the activity of change management. There are some of the things that this is the work of my students. It's and they also realize it's not 100% perfect, but we are definitely sure that this is not 100% wrong. So if I had done this, I would probably have related the sharing aspect of DevOps also to configuration identification. So the things that we need to share, where they are stored, that is the configuration management activity called configuration identification. But as a starting point, this will allow you to identify what it is that you want, what the DevOps characteristic you want to focus on, what DevOps characteristic that you find that you have problems with. Is it agile and lean? Is it monitoring? Is it collaboration, sharing, or whatever? And then trace that back to different software configuration management activities that might be very helpful for you in trying to deal with the problems that you are having. Now, looking a little further, we could also identify sub-practices for continuous delivery. We did that on a project where I collaborated with a couple of professors from the university in Copenhagen. And we found that some of the sub-practices and some of the things that you need to focus on if you're a configuration manager when you're doing continuous delivery, continuous deployment, or whatever you want to call it, is to automate the deploys. You create pipelines, you provision different environments, development environments, test environments, quality assurance environments, and whatever environments are needed, production environments also. One of the things that we know how to do and that we're experts in is to build quality gates. That's one of the things that where configuration managers often stand out as pains in the asses because we build quality gates and we don't want to let anything through unless it has a certain well-defined quality. We found that one of the things that the DevOps community had discovered was that they needed to separate code and configuration data. So they needed to do what they call one build. So if you have some code, an app that is using a database, then you probably, while you're developing it, you don't want to read and write the production database. So you have a small development database where you have some data. When you send it to test, you don't want to use the development database. You don't want to use the production database either. So you have a test database. If you have this sort of baked into the code, then the configuration manager becomes uneasy, because then we cannot use one build. Then you have to rebuild your code every time you go from one environment to another, which basically means that when you rebuild it, can we trust that it works? Well, don't worry, be happy seems to be the approach of some DevOps people. But that's one of the characteristics where DevOps people are different from software configuration management people. Sometimes we worry, and if something has been changed, like for instance, the database where you read and write your data, then we would very much like to build it again and to test it again to see that everything actually works. If you separate code and configuration data, then your configuration data is giving the data for what database that your code should use. And once the developer has built the code, then he can use that build to do his local testing, the unit testing. He can send that build to the test group, and they can use that with different configuration data to do their part of the testing. Then they can take the same build and send it further on to the quality assurance. They change the configuration data such that it writes in a different database. And finally, when you put it into production, you take the original build that the developer produced and you just change what database it is writing in. And then we have not touched one single thing in the build. Architecture, microservices is a hot word in the DevOps community. And we heard this morning that it's not always that easy. As a professor of computer science, I remember that when I was studying in the early 80s, it was already well known, the concept of modularization, which to me, more or less, is what microservices is about. So you should try to strive for high cohesion between your things, low coupling, traceability. So we will probably not ever have complete independence between the microservices. So tracing the dependencies, that's one of the tasks that configuration managers can do. If we can do that, then we can also do selective testing, so we don't have to run all our tests all of the time. If you're more comfortable with this figure of 8 for DevOps, together with a colleague, Ulstein from ABB in Sweden, we did an analysis of how the different phases of this relate to software configuration management. And these are the results that came out of it. So if you start with the monitoring phase, we need to define the metrics to monitor, collect and process data. Those two bullets are not very related to software configuration management, but what comes out are ideas for new things that we want to have in our application, or things that do not work as we intend them to work. And it means that we can propose some change requests, either that we would like to have this new feature because if we can see that people are using that part of the application, so we want to enrich that with more functionality, or we can see that they're having problems with a feature and we want that feature to become more user-friendly, or we find a bug and we propose a change request. Change requests is sort of what we configuration management people are doing. We can get change requests from all kinds of sources. We have a change management process, and all the change requests, they end up at a change control board. If you're doing DevOps, you might not call it a change control board. You might call it a planning game. You might call it grooming the backlog. But actually, what is going on and what should go on when you're grooming then the backlog is that you should do a change control board meeting. The result of that is that we have a plan. We have a number of change requests that we have decided that these are the change requests that we want to implement. And then we would like to be able to follow up on the status of these. So how many have been implemented and how many are still on the way. For the code phase, we need to handle parallel work. So unless there's only one single person on a team, then people will have to work in parallel. Then we'll be talking about continuous integration, and when things have been integrated, we have some source code that we can build. And build and releasing is also one of the core competences of software configuration managers. So automating of build processes has been known for, well, since the 70s when Stuart Feldman came out with Make. He was in need of a tool that could help him automate the build process, so he came up with Make, and all more new tools like Jenkins are sort of just extensions to Make. Since we are creating a whole lot of new configurations, so I was really surprised to learn about a bank that is on average is doing 4 deploys per day, weekends and holidays included. If you produce that many deploys, we need to be able to identify exactly what it is that we have. If you're like Spotify, then maybe it's not that important that you are able to know exactly what it is that you have in production in any moment. But I bet that if you are a bank and you get sued, then you would very much like to be able to produce evidence in court that this was how our production environment and the things that we had in production was looking like at the moment that this customer placed an order or whatever it is. We have produced the outcome of the builds are systems that can be tested and that are identified by a bill of material. Testing. Tests should be automated. If we have manual testing, then it'll probably be impossible to do 4 deploys per day on average. Even if we automate the testing, if we're doing a complete test and a complete test takes like 10 hours, if we are doing 4 deploys per day on average, then we run out of hours since the day has only 24 hours. So we should be selective about what tests we actually run, and the better we can have traceability between the code and the test cases that cover the code, the easier it will be to do this test selection and still have confidence in the testing phase. After the testing, we have verified systems. We can package the releases and put them through configuration audits, and then we have systems that are ready to be deployed. In deploy, we need to take care of the system configuration, the production configuration, and also automate the deployment. And then in the end, we have systems that are deployed and in production. The operation, well, the operation phase, I don't have very much from a software configuration management point of view to say about that. DevOps has sort of ignored or have had configuration management as an invisible and implicit thing. A couple of years ago, the State of DevOps report from Puppet for the first time mentioned a little bit about software configuration management. So they had a 5-stage model, starting from stage 0, for the evolution of DevOps in a company from the companies that they have studied before writing that year's State of DevOps report. So build a foundation to facilitate the sharing of ideas, metrics, knowledge, processes, and technologies. Normalize the technology stack, do agile, introduce some of the agile principles, introduce version control, which in my opinion should be already at stage 0, and talk about continuous integration, trying to integrate all the contributions of the different people on the team. The next stage, once you're done or fairly done with stage 1, is standardizing and reducing the variability. So reduce the overall complexity, reduce the errors from inconsistencies, expand the DevOps practices. So deployments are usually a huge pain. In many companies, actually, the resistance to DevOps and continuous deployment comes from the operation, because the faster the developers become, the more it becomes a problem for the operations to actually put all these deployment candidates into production. And we would like to provide more predictability and reliability into the deployment of things. At one of the earlier presentations, there was a question about whether there was a provision for rollback in the processes that they had. And if we have sufficient reliability, then actually things like rollback should not be an issue anymore. So if you have things that actually run, then sometimes, at least if you can have a fix fast into production again, then it's much easier and much better to roll forward. But if you have things that will actually break everything, then sometimes you will still need the good old-fashioned rollback. But if you have a high quality, if things work, they do not crash, but sometimes they don't work completely as intended. If you can find the bug, if you can fix the bug and have it into production within half an hour or 1 hour, then that will in some cases be faster than having to roll back and then do all the things. We should automate infrastructure delivery. So the delivery of environments and infrastructure for development, for testing, for quality assurance, for deployment. And when we arrive in Paradise, all these capabilities will be provided as self-service. If you're interested in the details, and there are more things, and also more things about configuration management in the report. It's like 80 pages, so there are quite some details in it. Then you can go and look up the State of DevOps report from 2018. So summarizing, from the research questions, we got some research answers. So actually all software configuration management concepts and principles are useful in a DevOps context. So there's nothing that we can forget as configuration managers when we move into a DevOps context and should service and support a DevOps project. Well, except for the activity of a software configuration management plan. That was the thing that my students wanted to leave out, because that didn't quite get into the DevOps spirit and the DevOps culture. And then what they suggested was that instead of starting out with a glorified software configuration management plan up front, then you desperately needed to have your software configuration management activities described and documented, and also in many cases automated as processes. So instead of doing a glorified plan that the team should follow, then you should focus on single activities, single things, and create processes and automation for those. The implementation of software configuration management needs to be different, and especially when we're talking with software configuration managers from traditional waterfall companies, we have to emphasize that the implementation should be much more lightweight, and we should do it on an as-need basis. There are a lot of agile aspects. Figure out where your pain points are and try to focus on the software configuration management aspects that are related to your pain points. There's a lot of continuous in DevOps. So you talk about continuous integration, continuous delivery, continuous deployment, continuous testing, and whatever. And when you talk about continuous, you automatically also talk about automation. So the principles should be do it once, do it twice, automate it. So if you have already done it twice, then it seems like a pattern. And instead of repeating manually that pattern, then it's much easier to just automate it. And there's a lot about quality gates. In DevOps, sometimes it's called quality gates. The term that we use in software configuration management is most often configuration audits. But basically, it's quality gates. If something doesn't have a sufficient quality, then it is bounced, and people have to fix it. And if it has a sufficient quality, and sometimes, at least on our student projects, then sufficient quality means I changed some lines of code, so then it passes the quality gate and goes into the repository. That doesn't even last one iteration, then they figure out that that quality gate is sort of too low. And they decide that the quality gate should be that it also compiles. Maybe it also runs all the unit tests and some of the acceptance tests and whatever. So what is the level of the quality gate will be up to each single situation. But the concept of a quality gate, of a configuration audit, is hardwired into the DNA of configuration managers. The conclusions. So SCM is not a one-size-fits-all. So you cannot do configuration management on a DevOps project just the way that you do it on a waterfall project. DevOps projects are also very varied in how they're doing it. So you have all the spectrum from these new electric scooters, where my students say that it seems like the quality gate is pretty low. So their focus must be on getting things out and testing whether people are actually using it. On the other end of the spectrum, I've been talking to people doing DevOps on the production of medical equipment, equipment that has to be scrutinized by the Food and Drug Administration in the US. And they find absolutely no problem in doing DevOps, and they find absolutely no problem in applying software configuration management principles. But they are probably applying them and implementing them in a different way than the scooter projects do. SCM does not have to be rocket science. At a meetup last year, I talked to a person who was taking care of the continuous delivery pipelines in the company. He had been recently hired to get that straightened out. And one of the first things that he introduced in the company was that it was not allowed to do any builds while you were connected to the internet. What he saw was that developers, they dynamically loaded libraries, compiled libraries into their code from the internet, which meant that there was absolutely no control over whether this library would be there in the future. So maybe an important piece of our software would not be reproducible because this library was not accessible anymore. There was absolutely no control over what version of the library that was used. And he said that we need to be a little more careful about that. To have the versioning is hardwired into configuration managers, and the fact that all the things that are important for a project should be under our control is what we call configuration identification, and we call these pieces that are important for configuration items. It's not rocket science, and it's a very lightweight way of implementing this. And the indications are that software configuration management is actually an important supporting activity also for the DevOps projects. Here are the references. So if you're interested in digging a little deeper into the details, you can Google these, and there's more to read. There's a lot more references than this, but these are the references that I have used today. Yep. That's the end of my presentation. And now it's up to you to go and look up the references and study the details.
Thank you, Lars. And we have 3 questions. The first is, do you need the DevOps need some kind of standardized framework such as ITL?
It's to me, it seems like ITIL is more useful for waterfall projects, for hierarchical projects, and for projects. Could be DevOps projects, but when you're using as a bank or as a company producing medical equipment. The important thing is not the framework in itself. The concepts and principles in ITIL are the same as they are in the IEEE standard for software configuration management. The way that differs is the rigor with which you implement stuff. And as we saw here, the recommendation and the things that came out of my students' research project was that we should do things on an as-need basis. And that was also why they left out the software configuration management plan from the needed activities of the needed things from the SCM.
Okay. And
so I think that starting from a framework of configuration management like ITIL or the IEEE standard and say this is what we should do on a DevOps project is probably not what I would do. Again, to do a sales pitch for my master thesis student's thesis, what I would do was that I would go and look up the DevOps characteristic. They have this wonderful figure in the report and look up the figure and see identify what are the pain points, what is causing most trouble of the DevOps characteristics, and then try to see how they trace to software configuration management activities, and then pick the low-hanging fruits and then iterate and repeat.
Okay, thank you. And another question is about the quality gate. The quality is very different project by project. As in Google, they see the quality as the performance the code has. Other project maybe needs a certain code coverage or I don't know. What's the equality gate you should suggest as a baseline standard?
Well, as I try to teach my students on the configuration management course that we as configuration managers are quality level agnostic. So if a project manager comes and tells me that he is completely satisfied with a lousy quality, I will implement a quality gate that will let a lousy quality pass. But a really sucking quality will not pass. I have personal opinions about what should be the level of the quality. And I think that when I was talking about substituting rollback with the concept of roll forward, that if you have a very, very high quality, then you don't need rollbacks anymore. Then you can just say, well, it sort of works. There's a little thing here and we need to fix it, and we can do that and have a new version out in production in like half an hour or 1 hour. If that is the quality, then we can allow ourselves to do these things.
So, but not having a rollback is more a KPI. So in a year, I didn't have any rollback, so my quality is high. But it is ex post the problem, not ex ante.
So sorry.
Sorry, I can manage a quality such as no rollback as a KPI at the end of a certain period of time.
Yes.
But I can't block a deploy on this kind of metric. Is it?
Yes. When we it's a very difficult and fuzzy area to go into discussions
Yeah.
of quality.
Absolutely.
And actually, we interviewed a company in Copenhagen that they do 10 deploys per day. They are roughly 8 to 10 developers, so they do 1 deploy per developer per day. And the developer that we interviewed said that the first time that he had to sort of push something and actually knew that this might end up in production, it was a little scary. Because again, he was not certain that the quality gate was sufficient, if the testing was sufficient. But he said that with experience, after a week, it was just like normal. You would push the button and sometimes it would bounce back and there was a problem, and sometimes it would just end up in production. And again, you should probably. And there was another company that we interviewed, and they had sort of a gated system. There were some things that they would sort of push into production, and there were other things, or actually everything would be pushed into staging. And then some things would immediately be promoted from staging to production, and other things they would let them simmer in staging for a day or 2 days before they felt confident that they were of a sufficient quality, and then they would promote them into production.
Thank you. The last question is, why do you think that SCM is ignored by DevOps team?
The short answer there is because of the universities.
Okay.
So if you don't, my experience is that when I start talking to DevOps people and I explain some of the concepts, then they are sort of doing it, but they have been sort of reinventing the wheel. And in software configuration management, we've been working with software configuration management, trying to figure out what it is and how to do it since the early mid-60s. So we have had a lot of experience. We've had a lot of dead ends, and I feel sorry that the DevOps people should have to repeat that when they could actually come and talk to us and have a few tips on how they could do things. We have a lot of experience with implementing these things. As I said, when I had the Wikipedia definition of DevOps, it sort of seems like we have the same goals.
It's more a marketing problem that a marketing communication problem that the methodology problem.
I mean, there are 2 universities in the world that are teaching software configuration management to the students. So there are a lot of people coming out of university that have never heard about configuration management, and many that have not even heard about version control. And they go on and they do startups and things like that. And another reason why configuration management is not so well seen from DevOps is probably if you try to have a rigid framework like ITIL, or if you have hire a configuration manager from a waterfall project, and he tries to impose sort of waterfall implementations of software configuration management, then I can understand why DevOps people start to hate configuration management.
Okay, yeah. So thank you. I hope to see you maybe next year in Bologna. And ciao.
So I will put up the slides, and so you can have all the references there on the slides. So
thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.